What was the Wild West? How did expansion, frontier life, conflict with the Native Americans, lawlessness, and economic opportunities define this period in American history? Okay, Wild West. Let's go to the map. And I'm going to show you the river Mississippi because it's going to be, well, relevant to what we're going to discuss here. So once again, we go to North America. Okay, and let's search for the Mississippi River. Mississippi River, United States. It's giving me is just 1 point. Okay, look, the Mississippi River, it drains out near Galveston. No, New Orleans, sorry. So somewhere here you have the drainage basin of the Mississippi River. Is it here? It's somewhere New Orleans, obviously. So is this the Mississippi? Yeah, this is the Mississippi. So the Mississippi River drains out into the Gulf of Mexico in the New Orleans region. Now, if you go north, if you go to, for example, Minneapolis, which is all the way north, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Well, if you zoom in, which river do we have here? It's the Mississippi. Would you believe it? And the Mississippi originates somewhere up here, up north. I'm not going to try and trace out the origins. I once did that. This is the Mississippi. It originates in a lake or something up north here, somewhere here. So it's a massive, gigantic river, the longest river system in the world. And it kind of divides the US into two halves. Not two halves, but an eastern part of the US and the western part of the US. And the Wild West was the region west of the Mississippi River. Okay, so that's the starting point of our discussion. The Wild West was the region of the US, present day US, which was west of the Mississippi River. So that's the geographical context. But what about the temporal context? What time period are we talking about? Wild West. We're talking about the 19th century. So the American Civil War ended in 1865. So from the time of the end of the Civil War in the US, 1865, to about 1900, that's the time period we're talking about when we're talking about the Wild West. So it was this frontier region of the US west of the Mississippi, and the frontier was always pushing westwards. Okay, so this period between 1865 and 1900 is when most of the western territories in the US were settled forcibly by the European origin people. They were settled, the territories were grabbed, they were fenced up, and then they were linked by railroads and roads. And then states were created. For example, Delaware is in the east, but yeah, you get the point. These states were created. So this period, what did you have in this period? You had rapid westward expansion of European colonists, settlers. They had to face harsh living conditions because there was no settlement there, European settlement. And the Europeans, what they would do was that they had guns and superior technology, and they would violently displace the Native Americans from the Native American territories, which eventually became the US West. Okay, and when you have this going on, there is no law. There's no court of law. The territory is unknown. There's very few Europeans there. There's no one to give you law and justice and police and all that. So there was essentially no law, which is lawlessness. But there were tremendous economic opportunities because new land, inexhaustible quantities of new land. The land was rich in resources. You could do mining in the land. Much of the land was good for mining. You could do ranching, agriculture on the land. Cattle ranching. You could raise cattle on that land, and you would link everything through railroads. Okay, so in the U.S. government at the time, the government's policies supported a transcontinental railroad system, and this encouraged millions of European origin settlers to start moving and pushing westwards. And they were told, whatever territories you grab, they're yours, essentially. Right? So huge, vast areas of grasslands, even deserts, were turned into farms and ranches and eventually towns, and people settled there. And the frontier line kept on inexorably moving westwards, pushing westwards. So new territories would be surveyed, They would be settled. The natives would be massacred or pushed out, right? And then these territories would eventually be turned into states. And eventually they're pushed out all the way to the Pacific Ocean in the West. So life in the frontier for the Europeans was pretty demanding. It was very isolated, small settlements. Yeah, families would live in small cabins, small houses. They had to cope with very harsh weather, extreme weather. Yeah, they had to rely on farming, essentially subsistence farming. They had to rely on hunting, um, or they had to initially rely on small scale ranching, and then they eventually built up churches. And yeah, churches are very important for European life at the time. And then local committees and schools. Um, and At this time, you also had something that was a devastating event, man-made event that was happening in the Americas, North America. The the near destruction of the American bison. So the Native Americans, they depended, especially the so-called Plains Indians in the Great Plains regions, they depended on the on the American bison for everything. The bison were called buffalo. So their entire lifestyle, livelihood, everything depended on the bison. They depended on the bison for meat, for fur. They depended on the bones of the bison for various things. Everything revolved around the bison. So the Americans, the European occupiers decided, let's kill off every last bison. That way, the entire lifestyle and livelihood uh, of the natives will be wiped out, and they will become helpless. As long as the bison exist, these people have all the power in the world, because they get all the food, everything from the bison. If the bison no longer exists, they will become completely helpless and dependent on us, and then we'll be able to make them do what we want. So the Americans went out with rifles, and they just started randomly shooting bisons. They killed hundreds of millions of bisons. And the North American bison was nearly made extinct. So this was going on at the time of the Wild West expansion. Yeah. So all these Native American population centers were devastated. The whites seized land for mining, for ranching, for settling. Whatever treaties they had made with the natives were broken. And then eventually they were able to subjugate all the tribes, massacre them, brutalize them, subjugate them, and push them onto reservations. Okay. And this process obviously involved multiple wars, which were called the Indian Wars. So you had wars with these native tribes. There were massacres all over the place. There were forcible removals of people from their territory and shoving them into territories hundreds of kilometers away. Yeah. There was resistance against the Europeans by groups like the Lakota, like the Cheyenne, and the Europeans retaliated with military campaigns and with policies whose objective was to end the indigenous control of the lands in North America. So you had all of this situation, and eventually they were able to start, settle down in towns, create towns, have law enforcement, and so on. But for a long time, you had a lawless state in the Wild West. You had theft, you had cattle theft, cattle rustling, they called. Sometimes you had big crimes and so on. You had vigilante justice. You had groups of people who would mete out justice. They were called posses. There are people who were hired as lawmen to fill the gap. They would have revolvers or guns or whatever. So everyday life for the white residents, white settlers, would be about routine disputes and so on, not the spectacular gunfights that you see in Hollywood movies. So that's how it was. And eventually, um, what you found is that the Europeans were able to push further westwards and settle, and this gave rise to tremendous economic opportunities for the Europeans. And this attracted a huge population, very diverse population. You had all kinds of European immigrants, Germans and Dutch people and all. You obviously had African Americans, slaves. You had Mexicans who would come and work. You had Chinese workers who had been imported, and so on. And all of this shaped the US economy, the US demography. And yeah, it was a time when you had essentially full freedom. So the Wild West was all about individual freedom and liberty and upward mobility. That was the Wild West in the US.